So we will go over some literary elements and devices in Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour. Now, the story was published in 1894, so that would be important context to keep in mind regarding our story here. Now, the first thing we know, we meet our character, Mrs. Mallard. Now, we also get her conflict that it is possible her husband has died and she has heart trouble, meaning like a surprise could possibly kill her. Now, her heart trouble is more of the conflict her sister and the husband's friend heard, because they are the ones that have heard that Brentley Mallard, that'd be Mrs. Mallard's husband, was on the list of killed. Now, if we didn't know when this story was published, the use of a telegram could tell us that it was sometime late 1800s, very early 1900s. Or the second half of the 1800s, pretty much all the 1800s, actually. So we could say that would be our setting. But we do know it was published in 1894. So looking for technology is an important way to figure out your story setting if you don't know when it was published. Now, we also get Mrs. Mallard when she learns this news. So Kate Chopin will say that she had a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. We would be then thinking of your 7 stages of grief, where the person is in denial, followed by anger. So we don't see any denial. She has an immediate acceptance. Next, she's going into a room. We're going to say this open window is most definitely symbolic, because we also see that it's going to be springtime. Spring is symbolic, meaning new life. Now, this would be odd. You could even say a little ironic, because normally death is associated with winter, whereas this story, it has a death, but it's in the spring. As she's sitting and looking out the window, and she's crying here, in the next page, we learn this is odd. Repression is going to mean someone is stifling you in some way or not letting you do what you may want to do. Repressed would mean something is a force that is not allowing you to do something. So the fact that her lines, we could say that's like the wrinkles on her face. She's supposed to be young, but then she has wrinkles that look like she has some worries or anxiety in her life. That would be unusual. Now we get to her feeling. So this would be Mrs. Mallard versus herself, because she's beginning to feel something that she cannot quite explain. And as it goes on, she was beginning to recognize this thing was approaching to possess her. She was striving to beat it back with all her will. This would be weird to be thinking, what kind of feeling would a person have that they didn't want to have? And then we get the free from under her breath. This can tell us that something was not all the way good with her marriage with Mr. Mallard, because she does say she will weep again when she sees him, weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. The face that had never looked save with love upon her. So here she's saying when she sees his dead body, like at the funeral, she will feel bad. But right now, she's starting to think there would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime, as she looked upon in that brief moment of illumination. You could say that this is like whenever someone is in a relationship, whether it be a friendship or a significant other or even a family member, people might always be suggesting that someone does something, or maybe even think something that the other person doesn't really want to. You could say this might be referring to something as simple as going to a movie or picking a restaurant. Somebody is always going to kind of have a power over your decisions and your life, unless you're totally alone, which just seems like what Mrs. Mallard was striving for. Now we also get more, that she had loved him sometimes, often she had not. That would definitely not be a good sign. And if you were to read what literary critics say about this story, the fact that she would say free, body and soul free, we could maybe assume that Mr. Mallard was maybe possibly abusive here, because you would want to also think, if you were a character, or you want to put yourself in the character's shoes, if somebody you were close to died, would this be what you were thinking? And if it's not, then you could think that something might have been, what could have caused you to think this? And that is how we can interpret it, because we're not going to get a lot of information in this story about Mr. and Mrs. Mallard's lives together. We only have the point of view of Mrs. Mallard. So now Mrs. Mallard's sister is asking her to open the door. Mrs. Mallard tells her she's not ill. She's breathing a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. So here we learn from Mrs. Mallard's point of view, she literally was hoping that her life would be short because she didn't want to be in her marriage. Now remember, this also would have been a time when women couldn't just ask for a divorce. It was almost unheard of in the late 1800s to get a divorce here. And now she comes down the stairs like a goddess of victory. She's so happy. But Mr. Mallard enters. He was not even near the scene of the accident. This would be a mistake on Richard's part. Richard tries to cover her, but he was too late. And now the final line of the story goes back to the very beginning of the story. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. She did die of her heart attack, but the irony here is everyone thinks Mrs. Mallard died of happiness, of seeing her husband, and she was so happy that it shocked her heart and she died. When in reality, we know that she had totally accepted her husband's death, and she was now focused on a life of freedom for herself. So these would be some notes that you could have from the story. We have our narration, third person, but solely the point of view of Mrs. Mallard. And our setting, springtime, we could say in a home, and we might say it was a typical town because there was a peddler down below. Characters, you have Mrs. Mallard. This would be all the definitions for repression. And we could really take this to mean, we can interpret it in many ways. The act of subduing someone or something by force. Restraint, prevention, inhibition. The action of suppressing a thought or desire in oneself so that it remains unconscious. We could say that maybe any one of these definitions could fit, because obviously Kate Chopin is not alive anymore, so no one can ask her. But we can tell that Mrs. Mallard was definitely not living her life to the fullest, to say the least, from that line there. Mr. Mallard, he's going to be basically our antagonist because he causes this problem for Mrs. Mallard. Also with the story takes place within an hour. So if we were wondering why the story is called The Story of an Hour, from the time that they tell Mrs. Mallard Brentley was killed to the time that he walks back through the door. Also,